What's up, guys? This is VinylicPuma, back with a clickbait title for you guys, and today I need to talk to you guys about Borderlands 3. Now, real quick, and to put at least some of the mouth frothers at ease, I think it's important to mention that I've had a lot of fun with Borderlands 3 so far, and I think it's done a lot of things right. After all, the game is only about a month old, and I have almost 8 to 9 days of playtime across all 4 of the current Vault Hunters. That, and given the various upgrades and additions in Borderlands 3, such as improved vehicle customization, the existence of alt-fire modes on weapons, and of course, most importantly, the decision to have Ice-T play Ascension Teddy Bear, and I think you can agree with me that Borderlands 3 definitely did a lot of things right. So again, and to put the mouth frothers, grumpy, disgruntled, and ominous they at bay, Borderlands 3 has done a lot of things right and is a good game. If you're on the fence, I think you'll definitely get your money's worth, as I sure did. However, I think as I, and perhaps maybe you the viewer, have experienced, I also feel Borderlands 3 leaves something to be desired. Mind you, and as I said before, Borderlands 3 is a good game, but I do feel that it doesn't quite reach that milestone of what could be considered great, like Borderlands 2 did. Some of that, I'll admit, may play into my nostalgia and love for Borderlands 2, but on the other hand, I think there are things Borderlands 2 just objectively did better. So today, I'll be discussing some of Borderlands 3's flaws, and make the case for why I think Borderlands 2 simply did things better. And of course, I'd be committing a YouTube sin for not asking you guys to smash the like button, and beyond that, what do you think of the term mouth frother? If you ask me, it's one of those terms you probably don't want to say 3 times fast. Otherwise, let's just go ahead and start by talking about some of Borderlands 3's missing features, and then work our way from there. As I'm sure many Borderlands 2 fans can attest, one of the best things Gearbox did with Borderlands 2 was to design the Rock, Paper, Genocide side quest. During this side quest, the player is tasked by Marcus to test out the crop of Borderlands 2's elemental weapons, where the player learns that fire beats flesh, corrosive beats armor, shock beats shields, and slag makes enemies take more damage. And of course, once all 4 of these related side quests were completed, the player is left with a target practice dummy, which they could then use to test the strength of their weapons or build. Fast forward to Borderlands 3, and well, none of these things are available, and I think that's a huge problem. For those that are new or are veterans of the franchise, it would have been greatly beneficial to explain how the cryo element was changed from the pre-sequel, and just simply how the radiation element works. In fact, and for radiation damage specifically, I had to look up on the internet to find out that the radiation element has an aura effect that can damage nearby enemies. Probably the bigger issue for veteran fans of the series, though, is that there's simply no target dummy for the player to practice on in Borderlands 3. Without the ability to test weapons and gear in a controlled environment where you don't have to worry about enemies moving or your character taking damage, it makes discovering the finer nuances of Borderlands 3's mechanics and design unnecessarily more difficult. It's also disappointing to see this feature not be in Borderlands 3, especially when it was in Borderlands 2, and many fans requested it be in Borderlands the pre-sequel. It's unfortunate to not see target dummies and at least a moderate explanation of Borderlands 3's elements appear in the base game. While it would be nice if they eventually got added in a DLC or whatever, I do think it's important to mention that the lack of their appearance within the core game itself will affect how people interact with Borderlands 3 over time. That, and I think many of you could agree that you'd much rather have a target dummy rather than a flip-up shooting range like we currently have. Something else that goes along with the lack of a target dummy is how the Guardian rank system was handled. In Borderlands 2, it was possible to turn off your bar, which much like Guardian ranks would boost your stats infinitely, albeit without the Guardian rank perks. In Borderlands 3, you can't ever turn Guardian ranks or their corresponding perks off to really test the strength of your weapons and build. After all, Cook Combo is always going to obscure the amount of damage you can deal, while extraneous bonuses to your gun, critical, and other sources of damage output also make it more difficult to determine what components of your build, weapon, and gear setup are really working. The other downside to not being able to toggle your Guardian rank bonuses and perks on and off is that it could hurt the potential of a time challenge community forming. Back in the Borderlands 2 days, players would see how fast they could complete a particular area and or defeat a boss. And of course, one of the things that was done to indicate a higher quality or higher skilled run would be to turn off bar. Again, and sort of like I mentioned when talking about the target dummy, without this simple toggle being present in Borderlands 3 at or close to launch, it could hurt the game over the long term. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying the Guardian rank system is bad per se, as in fact, I like it along with its perk system better than the bar system from Borderlands 2, but I do think it's worth noting that the inability to just simply turn Guardian ranks off makes Borderlands 3 a little more casual. Again, I think if it comes down to like friendly competition within the community, a run of maybe one of the trials without the Guardian rank system would be more impressive than one with the Guardian rank system. Speaking of casuals, and I hope that the Giant Dad approves of that spelling, one thing that is really strange about Borderlands 3 is the lack of raid bosses. Especially when you consider that the recently released Commander Lilith DLC for Borderlands 2 ended up having one of these raid bosses in the form of Haterx. While this has never really been done as well as it has been in Borderlands 2, it is at least worth noting that the feature was introduced in Borderlands 1 with Cromorax, and was sort of continued in Borderlands the pre-sequel with the Empyrean Sentinel. With that in mind, it's kind of surprising that the feature makes no appearance in Borderlands 3's base game, especially since it was really popular back in the Borderlands 2 days to time trial these types of bosses and see how fast you could kill them. After all, I remember many players would turn off their bar and try to kill these bosses solo. Now, to be fair, it is worth noting that trials areas have been implemented in the base game to where it's a test to see if you can get through these areas in under 5 minutes or so, but honestly, I'd still like to have my loot pinata raid bosses like I've had in previous titles. And given the high number of legendaries you can find in Borderlands 3, it's just a shame that you can't take on any raid bosses within the game itself. Again, it's kind of lame that there are no raid bosses in the core game, though it's highly likely we'll get some through DLC. Something else that I think Borderlands 2 did better revolves around loot. Now, to be fair, there are many things Borderlands 3 did correctly on this front, whether it be things like the introduction of item score, higher drop rates for legendaries, or adding good quest reward items you can receive during the main quest. With that said, I still think there are two notable issues. The first issue that comes to mind revolves around item parts and how many unique and legendary weapons seem to have fixed parts. Now, on the one hand, this is ideal for quest reward weapons since it means you usually only have to do a quest once to get the best version if you don't care about getting an anointed variant. On the flip side, this design ends up hard capping and greatly weakening a lot of legendaries relative to just random weapons you can find. As an example, I managed to find this non-unique Q system from Atlas, and it ends up having far better stats than this Rebel's Yell. While I'm not sure if the Rebel's Yell would be stronger than my Q system if it had a projectile multiplier, I do know it's a lot weaker without a projectile multiplier, and if my intuition is correct and this weapon has fixed parts, it does make the weapon far less desirable. Probably another great example of this is something like the Infinity. Of all of the versions I've managed to find, they all look identical. You're getting the exact same sight and the overall same look and feel across versions, even though you may get a different element from time to time. To be honest, a part of me longs to see an Infinity that looks more like this Creech, where I have dual silencers, a recoil stabilizer, and a projectile multiplier. Maybe it would be overpowered and thus Gearbox decided to have fixed part legendaries, but I still think that it would be awesome, even if it's not quite as pinpoint accurate as a double barrel Creech would be. Borderlands 2 didn't really do this, save for the Commander Lilith DLC where, unsurprisingly, a lot of the weapons had fixed parts and were kind of weakened as a result. After all, the Overcompensator was basically just a weaker version of the Butcher, while the Hector's Paradise was a weaker version of the Hornet. Now again, I don't mind that Borderlands 3 has a lot of weapons with fixed parts. I just wish there weren't so many legendaries that appear to have fixed parts. After all, I think a lot of these weapons are made less desirable as a result. The other issue revolves around how there are simply too many legendaries in this game. On the one hand, I feel bad complaining about this since I feel like I could easily find myself in another situation where I'd be complaining about how there are too few legendaries. But with that said, do any of the quest reward weapons need to be legendaries? Maybe the Cloud Kill could be one, since it's a reference to Maya, but what about the Amazing Grace, Red Suit, or Sellout? Sure, these are good items, but why do they need to be legendary specifically? The same goes for a lot of the special edition items that you get for purchasing specific versions of the game. Virtually all of the items you receive, whether it be the Cheddar Shredder, Combustor, or Hyper Hydrator, have legendary status, and to a certain extent, I have to wonder why these need to be legendaries. Now, I'll admit, I'm probably nitpicking here, and maybe even throughout this entire video, and feel free to let me know in the comments, but I think Borderlands 2 made legendaries feel a lot more exclusive. This could possibly be because the drop rates were far lower and Borderlands 3 has just spoiled me, but I also think it has to do with the quality of said legendaries too. Going back to the Rebel's Yell as an example, once I have a really high-end queue system, I have to wonder what the point of the Rebel's Yell is. It just seems kind of redundant, and though you would encounter a scenario like this in Borderlands 2 from time to time, I feel like this happens much more frequently in Borderlands 3, and that could be because there are just so many legendaries. I think if a lot of these legendaries could spawn with all sorts of wild and high-quality parts, then that could change things. At the very least, it would help the Rebel's Yell, but I do think there's just a lot of legendaries that don't really need to be legendaries, with probably the Girth Blaster Elite being a great example. And for our final topic of discussion, I should probably mention that I will be discussing the story, and if you haven't beaten the main story yet, I will be discussing spoilers. So this is your warning, and if you feel you need to leave, just be sure to smash like on your way out. That of course concludes your warning, so if you progress beyond this point, well, it's on you. One of the best things Borderlands 2 did with its story was the death of Roland. At least for me, I was playing through the campaign, I dealt with Angel, and then all of a sudden, Roland dies, I get warped by Lilith back to Sanctuary, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to take on Handsome Jack without either Lilith or Roland, who have been largely guiding the player through the game up to this point. The reason I think this works so well is due to the fact that Roland being killed is largely the climax of Borderlands 2's story arc. Just at the precise moment it's looking like you're going to win, Handsome Jack swoops in to ruin your day, and since Roland was a big part of the player's journey throughout Borderlands 2, his death is of great significance to the audience. Conversely, and as far as Borderlands 3 is concerned, the way Maya's subsequent death was handled isn't as satisfying. What could have been this really emotional moment for the player, much like Roland's death was, ends up being part of the game's rising action stage and by extension, has much less resonance. In fact, you actually formally meet Maya during Chapter 7, only for Maya to get killed off 3 or 4 missions later during Chapter 10. So again, I think it's fair to say that her death could have been handled a lot better, especially since Maya was a fan favorite for many in Borderlands 2. Now, to be fair, there are many aspects of the story that I like. After all, the troll ending that Gearbox does after you defeat Troy was pretty great, and I really liked the cameo of Ice-T as Balex. I also really like the introduction of Typhon DeLeon, even though he doesn't really appear in any of the previous titles. It's just a shame to see how Maya's death was handled, as I think it could have been so much better and far more satisfying. And I think if you compare it to Roland's death in Borderlands 2, Roland's death was of more significance. At the end of the day, guys, I do want to reiterate that Borderlands 3 in my mind has done a lot of things right. While I've been fairly critical throughout this video, just know that I'm doing it because I like Borderlands 3. Most of these are pretty small criticisms, and obviously I don't expect Gearbox to change the entire story, but I do think a lot of what I mentioned could be fixed. Again, it's not my game, but adding a target dummy, some raid bosses, changing up the loot a bit, and allowing players to toggle Guardian bonuses on and off could make what is already a good game great. Otherwise, guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you enjoyed this video, definitely be sure to smash like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload more Borderlands videos, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.